Be inspired, supported, and empowered. This is the Global Healthy Living Foundation podcast network.
You're listening to Healthcare Matters, the podcast that pulls back the curtain to help you make sense of complex healthcare economics and policy issues. Joining us, as always, is Dr. Robert Popovian, tuning in from Washington, D.C. He's a pharmacist, an economist, and the Chief Science Policy Officer at the Global Healthy Living Foundation.
And joining me is my good friend, Connor Mertens from Seattle, Washington, my co-host and our patient advocate and community outreach manager who does an outstanding job working with our patients. So Connor, to start this episode, I have an important number as always for you, and I would like to share the number 30%. Does that ring a bell for you? It's a number you may have read in the news lately, perhaps?
I mean, I think October's about 30% scarier and spookier when there's a Friday the 13th, so something along that line?
No, but I have to say, sadly, it has to do with drug shortages, that in the United States, drug shortages increased by nearly 30% between 2021 and 2022, according to a report commissioned by the Senate earlier this year. And this is an excellent transition to get into our topic for today.
That's interesting you mentioned that, Robert, this drug shortage, because I'm not just hearing from patients in the US about it, I'm hearing from our international patients as well. I don't think it's something that we're just seeing here, but you've been, for the past several weeks, attending and spoken at several national conferences. What are the top 3 topics that are commonly coming up on these presentations?
So not surprisingly, Connor, you and I have talked about this. We've had guests over to talk about these issues in the last few episodes that we've done. Not surprisingly, the number one thing you hear about drug pricing, specifically about Inflation Reduction Act and the impact on drug prices. The second thing, obviously, as always, you hear probably more than anybody else at GHL because you get calls from patients, has to do with healthcare affordability and patients' concerns about healthcare being affordable for them. But surprisingly to me, in these last few conferences, I attended one last week that had to do with cancer. It was a cancer conference that I spoke at. This week, I was at a cardiovascular conference. And in both of these conferences, the topic that came up was drug shortages. And it seems to be an epidemic of drug shortages that are going on. But I've been involved in this space for a while, so I have some of my own thoughts. And it was interesting to hear that from the attendees, basically.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, we've discussed these topics of drug pricing and the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, and just healthcare affordability generally in previous episodes. But we haven't addressed this issue of drug shortages yet. Why don't we dive into that topic? Can you just kind of break down for our audience what drug shortages are?
Yeah, so it's nothing new. First of all, we've been dealing with drug shortages at least since I've been aware of it for the last 2 decades, if not longer. But I think it ebbs and flows over time. We sort of get a handle on them, and then the drug shortages spike again. And it has to do commonly with concerns that patients and providers have, and they reach out to, for example, congressional members, and they look into it more closely. But it seems to me, Connor, that there's been a rash of drug shortages of various type of drugs in the last few months. And that's why Senate basically commissioned this report and that we were able to quote the 30% from. But there's been also hearings on the Hill, and there's a lot of concerns, obviously.
What kind of drugs are we seeing that are most commonly impacted, Robert? I've heard of Ozempic and maybe some cancer drugs, some chemo drugs. What are we seeing?
So we're seeing it all over the map. I mean, traditionally, the shortages has been in the sterile injectable space, right? So we're talking about drugs that are manufacturing is very complex. They're injected into patients, and we hadn't seen it much in the cancer or chemotherapy space, except for pediatric patients a while ago, which I first got involved in this topic. But you're right. And there are different issues, right? Ozempic, it's not a manufacturing issue, it's more a demand issue that's going on. A lot of people are demanding it, and the manufacturers are trying to supply it as soon as possible. In the other cases with the chemotherapy drugs, it's another issue with regards to distribution of this drug evenly across different markets. But with the sterile injectables like normal saline and things like that, that has to do with directly with manufacturing, where there's been issues with regards to where manufacturing has dropped And there are reasons for that. So,
Well, I mean, well, let's get into that. What are the reasons for these shortages?
yeah, primarily it's economics, frankly, Connor. The number one reason for many of these shortages, not Ozempic related, has to do with economics. It has to do with regards to complexity of these drugs being manufactured. And we have a good thing going in the United States where we have a very robust, as you know, we've talked about this on this podcast, a good generic industry. But what the generic industry has done also with regards to sterile injectables, these very complex drugs, is push these generic medicines that have been around for a long time. Their price is so low that the manufacturers are technically not making any money. So what happens? They end up like dropping out and stop manufacturing those drugs. And that also is for primarily economic reasons. They're just not making any money off of them. So they stop manufacturing them and then you end up having a shortage. But that has to do with that part of the drug. The other reasons are what I alluded to with the cancer chemotherapy drugs is the distribution. Majority of that shortage issue with cancer chemotherapy drugs that we've seen has happened in community oncology centers, not necessarily in the large oncology practices, not practices, but hospitals like Sloan Kettering. And the reason being is that there's uneven distribution of those drugs. These large institutions overbuy and the suppliers probably send them a lot more. And what happens is that the community oncologist who doesn't treat as many patients may end up having a shortage. And then the third reason, so we have economics, we have uneven distribution. The third reason is really reliance on raw materials. We've been far too long relied on China for raw materials, and we've seen a rash of shortages on antibiotics that we typically take for granted. You know, all of us get antibiotics for various colds and ailments. And we've seen a rash of those shortages, and that has to do with raw materials. There's been a disruption in the supply chain of getting these raw materials out of China and too much reliance on China, actually. So that needs to be addressed. So there's different reasons why we're seeing these different shortages in different therapeutic categories.
I think one of the questions that we always like to get into on this podcast is how does this impact patients? And I mean, you're a pharmacist, so you clearly have firsthand knowledge of this. What are the consequences for patient care with these shortages?
Well, the consequences can be severe, right? Let me give you my personal example with shortage. My daughter had a respiratory infection a few months ago, and we went to the physician. The physician prescribed some antibiotics. It's typical antibiotic you would get for a respiratory infection. I'm talking about amoxicillin. And I ended up going to the pharmacy to pick it up, and the pharmacist said, we don't have it. And that was unheard of, right? You would never walk into a pharmacy and not be able to get amoxicillin. And she said, we've back ordered for last few days. And she said, come back tomorrow. And the consequence for patients is delay in care. Now, this was a respiratory infection. It was important to treat the infection. Obviously, antibiotic is important. I was able to go to a different pharmacy and get it. But imagine now if a patient shows up for their chemo treatment and there's a shortage of the chemo drug, or worse, if it's some type of a cardiovascular disease. These things have consequences for patients if they are not able to acquire these drugs on a timely manner. So patient care does suffer, and there could be delay in care, and delay in care, as you know, Connor, leads to bad outcomes for patients.
And as you mentioned before, this isn't a new issue, right? Like you've dealt with this and you've seen this happen in the past.
Yeah, and it's not. And really, we've seen it ebb and flow over years. I personally saw it intensely come up about a dozen years ago. I had just moved to DC actually, and there was a lot of hearings and everything else regarding drug shortages that had to do with cancer chemotherapy drug for pediatric patients actually, which is even scarier, right? You were talking about little children who require that kind of therapy. And, as I mentioned, I mean, economy drives a lot of it. We've suppressed prices so much in the United States that some of these manufacturers of especially sterile injectables, they just don't make enough money. So they just get out of the market and they say, we can't make any money, so we're not going to supply it. And you're ending up with shortages because of that. So that's one reason. The other reasons are, we discussed too much reliance on China, maybe regulatory issues. So there are solutions that we can suggest that can fix the problem.
Well, then let's get into them. What are the solutions that you suggest? How can we combat these shortages and make sure that patients are getting a continuum of care and not missing out?
So, Connor, one of the things that we need to do is really rethink about our pricing policies in the United States. If you think about Inflation Reduction Act, technically we've put a ceiling on certain drugs now, right? Because there's going to be a price setting for certain medicines. And maybe it is time for us to think about a floor for prices. That, yeah, it's great that we have this robust generic market where 90% of prescriptions written in the United States are generics. But because of this competitive landscape, we suppressed prices so far down that some manufacturers drop out because they can't make any money, or worse, let's say if the FDA walks into a manufacturing facility and closes it up because of safety concern, then the supply chain just completely gets obliterated and that drug doesn't exist. So what I'm saying, one of the solutions may be for us as a society to think about a floor for prices, that certain prices for certain medicines should not be dropping so far down that it makes it non-lucrative for these manufacturers to stay in the game. There are different mechanisms and levers that we can do that through government policy that we can fix it. The other thing is what President Trump did, and definitely President Biden has followed through, is to create policies that we're less reliant on China, on not only manufacturing, but these raw materials and things like that, that we are able to procure these things from other countries rather than just China. Because again, we saw with the pandemic, as soon as the supply chain broke off, we ended up having shortages of these drugs. The third thing is regulatory. Make sure that the FDA is walking in and closing a facility, that there's a plan in place well in advance to be able to make sure that there's not shortage of the medicine because of that action. And in a non-related pharma side, think about what happened with baby formulas, right? A manufacturing facility that was supplying almost 80% of the supply for baby formulas in the United States. The FDA rightfully went in, shut it down, but because of that, we had massive shortages of baby formulas. Remember, people were like importing baby formula from Canada and European countries because there was significant shortages. And lastly, I think it's the uneven distribution that we talked about, especially with the chemotherapy drugs. I really think that's more of a distribution issue than a manufacturing shortage issue. It's hard because a lot of wholesalers, they sell these large volumes of these medicines to institutions that see a lot of patients. And what happens, because the uneven distribution affects community oncologists that are not seeing as many patients, but do see patients that require these medicines. So how do we make sure that there's not shortages for those type of practices?
Well, as always, thanks for breaking that down for us, Robert. We're going to make sure you get the last word in here, but what I'm taking away is these drug shortages, they're a preventable issue. And ultimately, the patients are the ones who suffer, and the folks that are vulnerable already are going to have serious problems with their continuum of care if these drug shortages aren't dealt with. But let's hear what you got to say.
No, you're absolutely right. And I'm going to use a quote from a great American, James Carville. You know him. He's from Louisiana, and he quoted the phrase, "Is the economy stupid?" during the Clinton administration. And I'm going to say the same thing. It's the economics of the generic drug pricing in this country that are causing a lot of the problems with the drug shortages. Yes, there's regulatory issues we need to address. We need to address the uneven distribution. We need to make sure we're not reliant on other countries. But the bottom line is that majority of these shortages are caused by the way that we've set up the pricing policies in the United States with regards to generic, especially with regards to generic sterile injectable, these complex medicines that are very expensive and difficult to make. And unless we address the economics of it, we're going to continuously go through this ebbs and flows of shortages.
I couldn't agree more, Robert. Thanks for breaking that down for us. And thank you to our listeners for tuning in to another episode of Healthcare Matters. Don't forget to subscribe to our podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you might be listening so you never miss an episode. And if you have a second, help spread the word by rating our podcast, writing one of those positive reviews, and sharing it with your friends and family. It'll help more people like you find us.
If you have any questions, thoughts, or suggestions, as always, please reach out to us. You can send us an email at podcasts@ghlf.org. As I mentioned earlier in the podcast episode, the reason we discussed the drug shortage issue is because it kept coming up in various meetings and settings that I was involved in. So we may use some of your thoughts and ideas in future episodes. Actually, if you're willing to come on, we will have you and host you on our podcast, right, Connor?
Absolutely, Robert. And before you go, be sure to take a listen to some of our other great podcasts on the GHLF Podcast Network. You can find all of GHLF's podcasts at ghlf.org/listen. As always, he's Dr. Robert Popovian.
And he's my good friend, Connor Mertens. See you all next time.
Be inspired, supported, and empowered. This is the Global Healthy Living Foundation Podcast Network.